Canadian football discussion. CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's up, CFL fans and fans of the 3-down game? Welcome to CFL 110. Andrew Paterson, Jeff Hamilton with you on a packed show with tons of news from around the league. Heading down the stretch in the final third of the regular season towards the CFL playoffs and, of course, the Grey Cup. We've got a full docket for you, which we'll get to coming out of another great weekend in the Canadian Football League. And it's great to have you all with us. Hammer, great to see you. Shout out to everyone that's joining us after Winnipeg Sports Talk live here on YouTube. And as well, a big thanks to everyone listening on the podcast. And just as we get into it, a huge thanks to our presenting sponsor of CFL 110, Garage Living Winnipeg. The push is on, folks. If you want to have a clean, organized garage this fall before the snow flies, give Garage Living a call at 999-1234. Our pal Pat's been getting a ton of calls. As soon as back to school hit, people are seeing all the kids' bikes, hockey and football equipment, you name it, all over the garage. Well, Garage Living has an innovative solution. It's called Slatwall, and there are dozens of hooks, baskets, and shelves that clip into it to get everything off your floor, even a cool golf club caddy and tire racks to store those winter tires. And the cool thing is you can do as much or as little of it as you want to fit within your budget. Don't miss your chance to clear the clutter, organize and beautify your garage with Slatwall, as well as polyaspartic floor coatings and made in Canada premium metal cabinetry for a total garage makeover. Visit their website and check out their amazing work at garageliving.com or call Pat Kanuga 204-999-1234 to book a free in-garage consultation or make an appointment to meet him at their showroom at 981 Main Street. CFL 110, brought to you by Garage Living Winnipeg. Garages made for living. Hammer, great to see you and talk to you again. I always look forward to Wednesday afternoons because we look forward to a big week. We've got lots to talk about, and especially here in Winnipeg, we started off with a big story coming out of the Banjo Bowl. Well, first off, there was so much talk about Miles Brown last week coming out of the Labor Day Classic. Mm-hmm. I would say it's hard to believe, but it's kind of not hard to believe that something's happened again, although it wasn't Zach Caleros, it is Chris Streveler, who, as we saw in his Instagram post yesterday, suffered a very serious knee injury with, 3 of his 4 knee ligaments being torn. I mean, an absolute disaster for Streveler and a huge loss for the Bombers for a player that was very versatile, handled all the short yardage, but was also the backup quarterback for this team.
Yeah, massive loss, man. And that's just like some of the things that Chris Streveler brings to the organization. Anyone that's ever known or met Chris Streveler knows just how big of a team player he is, knows how much he loves the game, the passion he has for the sport. I mean, I get it. He's in his late 20s. He's still very much young. I think he's not an old guy, not a super young guy, but it said a lot about him that he came back to the CFL after years in the NFL, after I'm sure opportunities outside of the game were presented to him. He's got a lot of stuff that he does on the side with coaching and supporting and teaching, young quarterbacks the game. So, him coming back to Winnipeg for the money that he took was a testament to his love for the 3-down game, his love for the city. And, I know a lot of fans are certainly disappointed, for what happened with the hit and of course the damage in which the hit took on Chris Streveler's left knee. As you mentioned, 3 of the 4 major ligaments. We're not talking about a guy who might come back ready to go for the start of next season. It's looking and feeling like a full year recovery. We'll wait and see. I don't want to be definitive on that, but that's usually what happens when you tear 3/4 of the major ligaments in your knee. But as far as what Chris Streveler brings to the organization, I mean, he brings that energy, he brings that day-to-day mentality. He essentially encompasses everything that the Bombers, believe in. The slogan that they have, the fit in or find your way out, we'll say politely. He's he's come to encompass that. It's tattooed on his leg. So certainly disappointing result in a hit. I think, Miles Brown's name's obviously been top of mind, particularly after the headshot on Zach Collaros that knocked him out of the second half of the Labor Day Classic. It didn't help, of course, that President and CEO, Bombers President and CEO Wade Miller added fuel to the fire in that and challenging Randy Ambrosie and the league officials to take better care of quarterbacks across the league, not just Zach Collaros. And so for Miles Brown to be kind of front and center of all this at the end, it's the debate is raging here, Huss. Is it an unfortunate coincidence, or is this a repeat offender? Where are you at with
Well, listen, I mean, he's certainly a guy that we've talked a lot about for unfortunate reasons. Second quarterback he's knocked out with a low hit this year. And of course, this coming off of what happened last week. I think what happened the previous week is a little more egregious. I mean, this was I will say this. I was at the game. We didn't get great replays of it. I've yet to see anything that shows an unequivocal dirty play when it actually happened. I mean, football is a rough and dangerous game, and guys get pushed down, and sometimes this sort of stuff just happens.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other players in the league, certainly in Winnipeg, that will get more of a benefit of the doubt, though, than Miles Brown. Did you think it was a dirty hit?
See, I don't think that one was a dirty hit. I mean, I tend to, make my opinions based on the people who are out there. And a lot of the players inside the Bombers locker room insisted that they didn't feel like it was a dirty play, and I tend to take their word for it. These are the guys who are in the trenches. They know the game better than anybody else, and they would have an idea of whether or not they felt it was, there was malice attached to it. Now, the thing that I alluded to at the start with being a repeat offender. Yeah, I mean, you can look at the headshots, the headshot, not plural, the headshot that Miles Brown had on Zach Collaros, and you can say, that's a dirty play. There's no doubt about it. Any shot to the helmet, is a dirty play. You look at the other two instances that his name's been around that's knocked out quarterbacks, and obviously this one with Chris Streveler and one earlier in the season where he rolled into the legs of Drew Brown. And while I don't think you can necessarily paint him with this brush of being an incredibly dirty player like we did and rightfully so with Garrett Marino a couple years ago in Saskatchewan, I think there might be. I think the jury is still out on this guy. I think that, he's played football, his whole life, or for, he's playing at the highest level. Where your body's capable of going. When you roll into these defenders, it's like the Matt Cook of hockey. I'm not suggesting he is the Matt Cook of football here, but there's a lot of plays that looked innocent in his career that he took full advantage of. And the only person who's going to know that for certain is Miles Brown. All I can say is that I don't think he's going to get the benefit of the doubt if he knocks another quarterback out of the game. And so, while I don't think we're ready to call him a dirty player or whatever you want, whatever adjective you want, I know there's certain people in this city that are willing to. I'm not there just yet, but I don't think that we can be chalking up coincidences if this happens again.
No, listen, I'm sort of with you on that. I mean, I give a lot of wiggle room at that position because there are collisions that, are unfortunate, and sometimes they're not the fault of the guys at all. The way they're getting blocked and accidental things happen. There was a 15-yard penalty on this play. So at that point, it was flagged as a 15-yard penalty, and, they'll deal with it moving forward. The Bombers have to deal with their quarterback situation, though. I mean, to me, my focus is on what does this team move going forward. I mean, we'll sort of get to the West overall, but the Bombers are still in a very good situation. There's 5 games remaining. They control their own destiny. If they can win out or stay ahead of BC, not get passed by anyone, they'll have the West final in Winnipeg, which I think is crucial for the Blue Bombers. But, Jeff, this is a season that has seen Zach Collaros leave 2 games, miss a game, and now their backup quarterback, who some would have argued they maybe needed to improve anyways if the guy was going to play a full game, is not there anymore. You look at BC, which has VA and Nathan Rourke, Edmonton, Ford, and MBT. There is such a big drop-off after Zach Collaros. How do the Bombers handle the absence of Streveler moving forward? And you can touch on the 2 guys they signed right now, but is this just the start of what Kyle Walters might be doing to solidify his roster with a legit number 2 plan if Zach Collaros goes down before the CFL trade deadline?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Huss, about being an interesting year, it's reminiscent of the 2019 season where quarterbacks were just going down seemingly every single week. It was really, I mean, you've always kind of needed two quarterbacks, if you will, two quarterbacks that are capable of playing the game and winning you games. But that became really important after the 2019 season, and it's rearing its ugly head again this year that you really do need two quality quarterbacks. And signing Chris Streveler, I know a lot of people thought it was gimmicky a little bit at the beginning about this guy, whether or not he's a bona fide, backup, or if he's just, a glorified running back, and certainly was going to be special for this team's short yardage. But Chris Streveler was also the guy who filled that void for Winnipeg, those players in the locker room, those coaches on the staff, as the number two backup that they felt they could win games with. They won a game already this year against a bad Calgary team, mind you, but that's pretty much what Chris Streveler is. And it was just unique because usually you have that, third short yardage, kind of development guy who's your next guy. He's almost got to play a role he's never played in his career. And then you have, number two as being your kind of go-to guy, right? Your guy to, the guy who's going to be next in line, or a development guy. It's really a different process. The Bombers thought they had both their short yardage and their bona fide number two wrapped up in that short yardage package that allowed, with Chris Streveler, that then allowed Terry Wilson to kind of develop under these two guys. And hopefully, and who knows, a year's time, maybe the end of this year, you test to see what you have, assuming that you would have had a similar season of the previous years where the last few games were up to, whatever you wanted to do with your lineup. That certainly isn't the case. Terry Wilson, while I think has shown some flashes with this organization, hasn't shown enough to suggest that he's capable of taking over a team and winning games and ultimately winning championships is what this organization is all about. So the search was on early. I believe that they were waiting for final tests on Chris Streveler. I think they had a pretty good idea of where it was headed, in the immediate aftermath of that game. So I imagine the search and the names being tossed out would have happened, almost immediately, at least talking about it. And they've come to two guys that just so happen to be recent releases, in Jake Dolegala, who was with the Riders for years until he got his release from the BC Lions this season, and Brian Scott, who's been in the tutelage of the Argos organization, who they were pretty high on, but had to, unfortunately for them, a bit of a numbers game. Obviously, when Chad Kelly came back in the fold, they had to let him go. So both those guys are now either in or headed to Winnipeg. They're going to be here this week. From what I understand, unless news is broken the last little bit, I don't think either guys has inked a contract. But what I'm also hearing is that both, there's a good chance that both guys will stick around this year. I don't know what that means for the future of Wilson, whether that means one of them will have to accept a spot on the practice roster, which I don't know what interest both those guys would have. You'd think they'd have some interest for that, considering, before now they weren't on a team at all. But certainly one of those guys is going to be asked to come in as the number two guy and likely to take over in a situation that Zach Collaros gets injured. Right now, like the early reports I had heard, Jake Dolegala was kind of the early front runner in that, but I don't think that means much until you get the guys on the field, see how they adapt to the playbook, see how they adjust to, Buck Pierce's offense. I'm sure Buck will be out there on the field looking at these guys, watching them, and having a big hand in that decision. But that's where we're at right now in Winnipeg, and we'll have more information. You know how this team works, Huss. They're not going to let you know who the number 2 is or 3 is until they're back on the field, and that's when I assume.
I guess my question is, post trade deadline, heading into the playoffs, are any of these guys the number 2 guy? And I kind of put this up. I saw your tweet yesterday, and I believe I kind of mentioned this on Monday on WST. I think about what BC has. I think about what Edmonton has. They are safe. They got 2 guys that can go out and win you a game when you need it. I'd love to be wrong, but I don't think the Blue Bombers have that guy right now. And we can't overlook the fact that Zach has been knocked out of a couple games and has not been available. And, there's so much that goes into this season. The team, has pulled themselves out from the way they started. The defense has been great. The special teams has been awesome. The offense is coming around. If Zach Collaros isn't there, how do they beat Edmonton or BC? I think they need another guy that has more experience. And that's why when you look around the league, Hamilton is likely not going to be in the postseason. By the time the trade deadline comes, they're probably eliminated. If that happens, Is there a possibility that the Bombers get Bo Levi Mitchell? He comes off their cap. They save a little bit of money. If he ends up playing, maybe it's a deal like the Caleros deal in 2019, where there's a conditional first-round pick involved, something like that. I mean, Ottawa's in a great spot right now, and they will be a playoff team. They've got a very crowded quarterback room. Might they be able to move off a Jeremiah Masoli? Would they feel comfortable doing that for a playoff team? I'm not sure they would. But I do wonder if there is another option like Kyle Walters found in 2019 for the Bombers, if their number one guy can't go, that still gives them a chance to compete with an Edmonton or BC, because I'm afraid that right now, at least on what's come in, sure, you might solve the short yardage problem. That's not my concern. I'm worried about what happens if Zach Caleros can't go for the Bombers. Are they doomed?
It's a good question. I think what would your answer have been, Huss, if Streveler didn't get hurt? Would you
I still wouldn't have minded them adding another guy, having Streveler be the short yardage guy and play around, because listen, and we're not going to have to worry about this. And I mean, I feel terrible for Chris. He's such a great guy, but I mean, look at what happened at the end of the Labor Day game. Now, to his defense,
That's what I mean.
I think that they called that game in a particular way because they had that lead. I mean, Chris did in Calgary earlier this year come in for Zach Caleros and lead them the length of the field late in the fourth quarter to get that game to overtime. They didn't win the game, but he did show spurts. But listen, as I said, he's not an option no matter what. Like putting the entire season on the shoulder and arm of Zach Caleros is the plan, I know, going forward, but just you'd hate to see a season that has turned around the way that it is and everything that they've earned to put themselves in the position they are go up in smoke if your number one guy can't go. Their contemporaries have a much better situation in the West right now. If that were to happen to their number one, I do wonder how concerning that is to the Bombers and whether they do make a move for a more experienced veteran, if available, to add at the deadline.
Yeah, and so to that point, there's two issues in it. I mentioned this on Winnipeg Sports Talk on Monday, Huss. I don't think there's a lot of teams out there that are going to be looking to help out the Winnipeg Blue Bombers get to a fifth straight Grey Cup. I think there's a lot of teams, if not all of them, that are sick and tired of seeing Winnipeg make it to the top of the mountain. Now, mind you, they haven't won the last 2 years, but they've been there. So I don't think there's a lot of help on the way, a la Jeremiah Masoli, a la Bo Levi Mitchell. That being said, maybe the positive thing in that is that, you are trading them to a different division. And even if you're Ottawa, are you doing right by Jeremiah Masoli? Does Jeremiah, in that situation, let's just use him as an example. Does he want to leave Ottawa? Does he want to go and be a backup somewhere else and wait for someone to get injured? I think that plays into it. I do know that Jeremiah Masoli and Zach Caleros are good friends, so I don't think it would be a bad landing spot for him. But again, I go back to Ottawa, not really wanting to help Winnipeg out. Hamilton, the team that lost 2 Grey Cups in a row to Winnipeg. I mean, I know Orlando Steinauer and Mike O'Shea are pretty good buddies. Maybe a deal can be worked out for Bo Levi Mitchell. But again, I just see, I'm not sure if that's a possibility. We talked about on Monday about being potentially a distraction. I don't think, I think Bo Levi Mitchell was here to be a great teammate or whatever, but I think he's still starting games in Hamilton. And until, they fall out of the playoff picture entirely, you're not going to be seeing a lot of change moves. And the other thing, Huss, about it is that's just not the way Winnipeg does business. I mean, look at the way that Zach Caleros became a member of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. It took injuries not just to Matt Nichols, but to Matt Nichols and Chris Streveler for them to finally pull the trigger on a trade. They don't work in the business of thinking the worst is going to happen and that necessarily feeling like they need a number two. I think I think you're completely right in that there's more risk than there's ever been with Zach this season. Last year he was hurt for the Grey Cup. This season he's been out a couple games and missed one. So there is some concern there, but to think that you're going to try to pull all these trades away and whatever for a guy who may or may not play is just not something the Bombers will do unless it seems like it's dire need.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned, the Zach's last year and being out earlier this season, and the fact that I mean, like, let's just look at what's happened these last two games. I mean, they've lost a quarterback in both of these games. I mean, I don't think you can be too sure in a situation like this with how much rides on that particular position. And I'm going to be interested to follow this moving forward because I'm not sure that Kyle Walters is completely done yet. And we'll certainly have a good conversation around these parts on the CFL deadline coming up. Moving on to the second place team in the Banjo Bowl. It's crazy, man. The Riders had that great start. I'm with you. They've got a new atmosphere around it. They've got a new leader in Corey Mace. But they've sort of regressed to a team that is good enough to look good at times in games, but are just falling short. They are on the bye this week. They're going to be playing on the 20th of September. It will be more than 2 months since the Saskatchewan Roughriders won a football game. July 19th against Winnipeg back at Mosaic Stadium was the last time that they won. They are now just a half game up on the Edmonton Elks for the third place and the final playoff spot in the West. What do you make of the situation the Riders are in coming out of the home and home against the Bombers, losing both? And how much tighter are the collars in and around Regina after everything seemed so positive to begin the season?
Yeah, it's funny to say out loud the Corey Mace effect right now, because if Corey Mace has had any effect over the last X amount of games, it hasn't been a positive one, particularly, late in that loss to Toronto where, he didn't quite understand the clock management situation. But, I still think Corey Mace is a good coach. I still think he's the right coach for this team. But as for the callers, it's been an interesting exercise, Haas, as the Riders have been on their free fall here for the last, as you mentioned, almost 2 months. I've tuned into 980 CJME, Jamie Nye, his post-game show, and the callers, man. I mean, I'm not surprised, but they want Mace out. They want Trevor Harris sat for Shea Paterson. They want all these things, things that a frustrated fan base would want. They want the quarterback gone. They want the head coach gone. You got to think they're not feeling at all about, good about a potential turnaround here, as, that wild stat continues to cloud itself over this organization. The fact that they haven't won a game after Labor Day weekend since the 2021 season. I don't think fans are feeling all that good or confident about a turnaround, but I'll say this, just with the Trevor Harris thing, Trevor Harris is not the problem. I get it that he threw 2 interceptions last game. Those were costly interceptions. You can argue that they were the difference in the game, and they probably were. But that guy is playing not like he's 39 years old. I think he's fitting balls into tight windows. He's not getting all the help that he needs from his receivers who have dropped balls week after week. I don't think he's the problem, and he's doing it in front of a battered O-line. He's making a battered O-line look like a decent O-line without getting sacked once in last week's game. So I don't think Trevor Harris is the issue. I don't think Corey Mace is the issue. A lot of people have been, questioning the whole theory about the culture he's brought in. Look, you don't have to be around this team all that long or for a long period of time to understand that he has brought in a different culture. I still have the benefit and privilege of traveling this country, covering road games for the Bombers. I've been in and around the Roughriders, throughout the seasons. I saw what it was like, through the Craig Dickinson era and how the players, acted and their attitudes and all those things. And it's much different under Corey Mace. Believe it or not, while mirrored in a 7-game winless streak, the spirits are still relatively high in Riderville. Now, how much longer are they going to stay that way? It looked like some of the cracks started showing in that Winnipeg game with some undisciplined penalties down the stretch, including Jameer Thurman just ripping Brady Oliveira to the ground, out of bounds. And it just was an unnecessary penalty and a showing, if you will, of a lack of discipline that really hasn't been a big issue in Saskatchewan this year. But, I'll remind I won't remind viewers. I'll remind readers of my CFL Rundown column in the Winnipeg Free Press every Wednesday. I wrote, heading into this year that there were going to be some inevitable growing pains with Corey Mace being a new head coach, and not just being a new head coach, but also being responsible for the defense as well as the defensive coordinator. That's a lot to ask of a young guy, of a first-year head coach, to handle the play calling on defense and all the in-game decisions. And, while it was kind of smooth sailing through the first bit here as the Riders went out, a pretty hot start and we're atop the West. It's kind of regressed to where it probably should have been in some ways with this organization. And but Mike O'Shea was 12-24 in his first 2 seasons in Winnipeg, and he just registered his 103rd victory, to put him ahead of the legendary Bud Grant for most wins in Bombers franchise history. So a little patience can go a long way, although I do understand the frustration. It'll be interesting to see what the Riders can do down this final stretch, because if they continue their curse, if you will, after Labor Day, I don't know how you explain that situation over in Regina.
No, you're listen, you make a great point. I love the comparison to the start of Mike O'Shea, who was taken over a broken team and moved it forward, but it doesn't happen overnight. And it kind of seemed like it had happened overnight with the way that the Riders started this year. But this has been, unfortunately, a 2-month-long reality check for this club. And right now, they are in an absolute dogfight in the West. Well, we'll touch on the West in a second. The one team that I am willing right now to kind of cross off when it comes to the West is the Calgary Stampeders. Now, they still certainly have enough track left to turn things around and get in the win column and maybe be that third playoff team. I don't see it happening, though, the way this team has played as of late, swept in the Battle of Alberta on Labor Day and last weekend. They were the one team that was fortunate enough to not have any quarterback injuries, but they had to change it because of performance right now. Any reason to think that the Calgary Stampeders can turn around their recent fortunes and be playing meaningful games in those last couple of weeks of the season and potentially being part of the West playoffs?
In this league, anything can happen. So ruling out something definitively doesn't make any sense.
Very true.
But the closest that you can to a guarantee, I don't think the Stamps are cooked. I mean, this is a, for a team that was treading water for the last month and a bit, not quite understanding who they were, who they weren't, they were lucky to be hovering around 500 for as long as they were. And I think we're starting to see a broken locker room, man, a broken franchise. I don't, you aren't, they're not necessarily, bad characters on the field, but it just doesn't seem like they're willing to put in the work to be a proud franchise that the Stampeders once were. And it's getting, to the point where you're benching your number one based on performance the game after the Labor Day weekend, which is, again, the time of year that we all consider when the real football starts. So if we're going off that theory, Dave Dickinson had just seen enough of Jake Maier, including his 4 interceptions in the Labor Day Classic in that loss to the Elks. But what was he thinking when Logan Bonner, and I don't mind the move. I think it was a bold move. I think you kind of knew what you were getting with Jake Maier. I think that Dave Dickinson looked at starting Jake and thought, okay, maybe we lose by a touchdown, 10 points, maybe whatever. But we're probably not going to win that game. I think it took guts to put Logan Bonner, who had a good collegiate career, like most pivots who stick around here did, and just give him a chance. Because I think you knew what Jake's ceiling was, what quite possibly could be this Logan Bonner's ceiling. And we've seen a couple times already this year, we've seen it a few times over the last few years, that someone comes in and it's exactly the spark that a team needs. Much like we saw Davis Alexander in Montreal. Granted, he had a much better team behind him, of course. We saw Cameron Dukes play well, with Chad Kelly out. We've seen guys. We saw Jake Dolegala, the newest member of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, come in Saskatchewan and reel off victories against the BC Lions and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers at the height of their organizations, arguably. So there's been this kind of quick, instant, results. It just didn't come. And I wonder what Dickinson was thinking at the end of the game when Logan Bonner didn't throw 4 interceptions. He threw 5 interceptions. This is a bad situation for Calgary. It's a bad situation in the locker room. It's a bad situation seemingly among the coaching staff. And Huss, here's my question back to you. Are we seeing the end of the Dave Dickinson era in Calgary, or potentially the start of the end?
Well, it's funny you say that, because if you've seen how frustrated that Dave has looked on the sidelines and in interviews yesterday, you do wonder if something's got to give. I mean, this guy has been a mainstay in Calgary and in the Canadian Football League for a few decades as a player and as a head coach. I certainly think that he's proven he's very much capable of doing the job. But whether it is on the personnel side that's not working or whether it's on the coaching, I don't know how you run this back, unless they have some miraculous turnaround that I personally am not expecting to see. Then the one thing I think we can say unequivocally is that there needs to be whether a straight up new number one quarterback in Calgary or at least some guys that can come in and truly challenge Jake Mayer for the job, because he has not been good enough this year. And, to the point where, you mentioned they went with the younger quarterback in one of the biggest games of the season, arguably with their season on the line. So if Dickinson is back, I think the team probably looks quite differently. And I think maybe there's some different responsibilities on the shoulders of Dave as we've seen this sort of slide continue into another season, which of course brings us to the wild, wild west. And I'm not sure it's ever been wilder than it is right now. What a win by BC in Montreal on Friday night. That's a very tough spot for BC traveling, although they historically have done actually quite well there, not as much in Ontario. But they beat the number one team in the Canadian Football League, the Montreal Alouettes, maybe serving notice that they're back after that blip in the middle of the season and the first two losses with Nathan Rourke. Bombers and Lions both at 7-6. They won't see each other again. My read on this is going to be one of these two teams hosting the West Final. Whether it's Winnipeg or whether it's BC, that'll be determined by those final 5 games. Admittedly, I have pretty much written the Stampeders off. And as much as we'll see an incredible race for first place between Winnipeg and BC, it might be as interesting and exciting to see what happens with Saskatchewan and Edmonton, who are separated by a half point, a tie that Saskatchewan has, and they have a head-to-head matchup. I can't remember a scenario where there was so much still at stake for so many teams with just 5 games remaining.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the beauty of this end of season schedule, if you will, Huss, is that even Edmonton has an opportunity here, right? Like they've dug themselves a hole, obviously, early on, but they play the Bombers back to back, and I think coming off the bye week, so that's going to be obviously a huge home-and-home series between those teams, and where they end up, the Bombers have the opportunity to completely wipe out the Elks, essentially, from catching up to them. It already is going to be a very difficult situation, but that's the one season series that the Bombers have yet to wrap up in the West. So that will be a critical one for them. And the Elks have been flying high. They'll go back to Trey Ford. But I see it as a 2-horse race here, Huss. And it's between the BC Lions and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. And, I mean, you can't look at these two teams, the Bombers and Lions schedule and make the argument that the Bombers have an easier route here. I mean, you have the BC Lions who, this week end up playing the Toronto Argonauts. They host them. Toronto seems to be free falling with the return of Chad Kelly. So they haven't been playing their great game, but I'm not going to say it's going to be an easy out, but it's not going to be necessarily a difficult one. And then they play Hamilton and Calgary at home. Hamilton is probably the worst team in the league next to Calgary. So that looks like 2 games that Rourke's going to be able to light things up. And then they wrap things up with a game in Saskatchewan. We'll see where the Roughriders are at that point in the season. Can they be competitive? Maybe they make a run. Who knows? And then they wrap things up with a game against the Montreal Alouettes, which by that point in time in the season, they for sure probably have it wrapped up. Now that's the second last week of the regular season. And if you look at the Lions, they also, if you're listening to what I was saying, there's 4 out of their 5 games remaining are at home. And we know what the BC Lions are like at BC Place. They're dominant unless the Bombers show up there. And you switch over to Winnipeg and they have 3 of their last 5 games on the road. Now, I think they'll benefit here. Look, that's why I say the Edmonton games are massive right here. If the Bombers can continue their momentum here, if they can go into Edmonton next week and get the victory and then can sweep that home and home the following week at Princess Auto Stadium, they're going to put themselves in a great situation because then they welcome the Hamilton Tiger, or they head over to Hamilton Tiger Cats. Now, that's no easy feat. Now, the Hamilton Tiger Cats are bad this year. There's no doubt about it. But even in the years they haven't been great, Huss, I kept going back seasons to see the last time the Winnipeg Blue Bombers won in Hamilton. Now, mind you, we're not counting. No, don't you dare. We're not counting that Grey Cup victory at Tim Hortons Field in 21. We're not doing that. However, they haven't won a regular season game in Hamilton since before COVID, since before the 2018 season. I think it was in 2017 the last time they won. So they haven't won a lot of games in Hamilton. We all know how difficult it is to win there. So that all of a sudden doesn't feel like an easy game. And then they welcome Toronto. Toronto may or may not be in a fight for second place, to host a home playoff game. We'll see what that's like in week 19. And then they get a bye week in week 20, and then probably get a bit of a break against the Montreal Alouettes in week 21. They'll have wrapped up the East. So that will be. So my point in saying that is it looks like BC has an easier route. Now the advantage for Winnipeg, obviously, is they have the tiebreaker. So they have, the BC Lions need to beat them by, a full game or a tie if that can somehow happen again this season. So they need to beat the Bombers outright. They can't just tie them. So that does put a little bit of an advantage in Winnipeg's side. But I do think BC, with just the way they're playing right now, with Rourke finding his groove, with Matthew Betts adding some energy to that defense, they are going to make it incredibly hard on Winnipeg, and I wouldn't be surprised if by the end they're the ones that slide into that very important first place in the West and much easier route to the Grey Cup.
Well, listen, I mean, I think that the Bombers have proven before. To your point, they've been very successful at BC Place, and in fact, some of the Bombers' best football has been on the road in BC. I still think that if Winnipeg wants to win this Grey Cup, they got to be hosting the BC Lions in the cold in the middle of November for a trip to go back there. And listen, the ball is in their court. But as you mentioned, I mean, this Edmonton team is no joke. They are looking like very much a playoff team and a team that could potentially make some serious noise when they get there. So the home and home between Winnipeg and Edmonton is going to be amazing. And I'd wonder, I might have to lean on Patty and Jake over at Coolbet to give us a line right now on Edmonton versus Saskatchewan, who makes the playoffs, because the teams are basically tied. As they say, Saskatchewan has the benefit of a half game. They play head-to-head. That game could very well make it. But I would say that it's more likely that Edmonton makes it, even with the schedule they have with the home and home against the Bombers and the game against the Riders, just because of how well they've been playing as opposed to some of their contemporaries in the West. You mentioned the Argos a little earlier. And I think the thought certainly in Toronto was that Chad Kelly was going to come back despite everything that surrounds that guy off the field, that he would sort of solidify their offense. That hasn't happened. I mean, they lost to Hamilton in a game that, often you can throw the records out on Labor Day. They came back. I was expecting a great performance from Toronto. That game was over before it barely got started. I think they were down 27-3 at one point. What to make of the Argos now at 6-6, behind Ottawa, behind Montreal, as we go down the stretch?
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, I think the Argos, I'm sure Chad Kelly assumed that his return would be better than it has been. I mean, I don't think people looked at the reigning MOP. Now, mind you, of course, he didn't have a training camp. He missed half the season. He didn't miss half the season in training camp owing to a knee injury or a shoulder issue or whatever. He still could work out. So his game shape might have taken a hit, I don't think his physical shape should have all been affected. But, 3 games, he's got 4 passing touchdowns, 6 interceptions, including 4 last game. Like, it's great if you can throw, for more than 400 yards in a game and 3 touchdowns. But when they're asking you to drop back and throw 56 times last week, I think anybody could get those stats. That's an insane amount. Something's going on in Toronto. They're not the team they were. It was interesting. It was interesting to hear a Darius Pickett talk after the game. I don't know if you caught those comments, Huss, but he seemingly took a shot in his post-game interview with Claire Hanna on TSN about kind of comparing that game that Kelly played into to the one in the East Final when they were teammates, and then the interview essentially extended to taking a shot at the Argos and not contacting him over the offseason and seeing if he wanted to come back. And that sounds just crazy to me. I mean, there can be some explanations in that. I mean, this isn't a guy who, one defensive player out of the East. Last year the guy wore a jacket that literally said a Darius Pickett on it. So I know Mike O'Shea isn't signing a guy who wears his own branded jacket to an awards thing. I'm sure Mike noticed that. And while he would be a talented player, so maybe there's some other issues. Maybe it's the fact that he's mouthing off to his former team, that, maybe there's some attitude stuff there. I don't want to speculate, but here I am doing anyways. But I do think it's ridiculous that you wouldn't make a phone call to the guy who is a beast, and is playing that way, was that way in Montreal and was certainly that way in Toronto, is now playing well in Ottawa. But I don't know what's up with that organization. Some interesting moves here. Chad Kelly, even with his MOP season last year, I think, that's one season of him. Maybe this is closer to what he brings. Now, it's probably somewhere in the middle. I don't think he's as bad as he's been playing, but I thought there were a couple occasions in the game against Ottawa where it looked like Ryan Dinwiddie might be looking towards Cameron Dukes to take over, but alas, he stuck with them. And I think people who are looking for a QB change or suggesting a QB change, I don't think you stick beside a guy for a whole half season. You talk about how he's your guy. You stick with him through this whole sexual harassment case with one of your former staffers, and then 3 games into it just go, yeah, he's not what we thought he was, he's gone. I think they're going to stick with him, rightfully or wrongfully, and I guess the hope is that he can form back into that guy. I think what was a good thing about what's been maybe a silver lining here is Damien Coxey's been a guy who's been waking up over the last few weeks with Chad Kelly behind center, so they've been able to get some guys going that have been kind of falling behind in the last month or so, but it's not a good look here. And what looked like an opportunity to fight for second place against Ottawa is suddenly, in danger. I don't think the Argos are necessarily in trouble of losing a playoff spot through a crossover to the West. How crazy does that sound, even suggesting at this point in the season, given what we saw from the East earlier in the year? But now they're at risk of falling out of playoff spots. Something's got to change there, and something's got to change quick in Toronto. But I don't think it's going to be the quarterback situation.
Yeah. Listen, I still think that'll be an interesting game if they play Ottawa in the 2-3 game in the East. I mean, Ottawa, with that big win and the margin of victory, got into a positive points differential for their season. And they're 8-3-1 right now. They've earned it, and they will, in all likelihood, be the home team. And obviously, I think they build a lot of confidence from that. But the Toronto Argonauts know full well that it really doesn't matter what your record is come the playoffs. It's how you execute. And they learned the hard way last year, speaking of Chad Kelly, in that game against the Montreal Alouettes after a brilliant 16-2 regular season. Well, we think those 3 teams are going to be playoff bound. The Hamilton Tiger Cats mired in the basement of the Canadian Football League at 3-9. It is hard to imagine, barring a complete faceplant by the Argos, that they would be able to get in the East. Now, with where Saskatchewan and Edmonton are, including head-to-head action, I mean, you're basically looking at needing to win 8 games probably for a crossover in the West. It could be lights out for the Ticats relatively soon. Where do they go from here? And I mean, for all the talk, we mentioned Bo Levi, his future right now. What do you think's at stake right now for the Ticats, the coaching staff, and management right now after such a disappointing season for a team that is supported really well by the hardcores in the Hammer?
I don't think that the organization is headed towards an overhaul. I think I don't think they're happy with Scott Milanovich's results this year, but I think they're okay with him as the head coach. They've had some turnover on the staff, of course, this season. I think I just don't see much movement. I mean, especially Orlando Steinhauer moving into his kind of role in the, in the upper management. I don't think that's going to change, but I do think the heat's going to be on them. There's a lot of, that's a prideful football town, right? They're still very much active at the games, and they have a great crowd. They won't accept mediocrity for too much longer. And when you add on the fact that they're still the team with the longest, running Grey Cup drought right now, it only adds to that pressure. But you look at Hamilton. You mentioned Hamilton, Huss. You mentioned, let's just take the potential of a West crossover completely out of the equation right now. And I'm not going to spend too much time making the argument that the Ticats can turn things around here. And I still go back to that game against Winnipeg where they blew it in the final drive. I think this season would look drastically different for them right now if they were at 4-8 and not 3-9. Because when you look at their schedule, Huss, their schedule is it's not easy at all. The Ticats have to, I guess the Ticats have to play, Ottawa this week, or not this week. Ticats are off on a break this week, but they'll end up playing, they're back this week, my mistake, against Ottawa this week. So that's going to be a very tough game at home, but it's at home. Then they got to play Toronto. Now, they've already beat Toronto twice this year. They already have the season series with Toronto. So asking them to beat them again might not be easy, but I don't think it's necessarily impossible. And when you look at them, they have to then they play on the road in BC, then they play at home in Winnipeg. I mentioned the success they've had in Winnipeg. Then they play at home against Calgary, and then they're against Ottawa in week 21. If we're going to use the same logic of the Montreal Alouettes, maybe wrapping up first place, then that probably means that the Ottawa Red Blacks are going to wrap up second place sooner than later. So that game could prove to be absolutely nothing. And while that doesn't sound like an easy schedule, I think they could, if they really are in, they're in that locker room saying, guys, we're not statistically eliminated. We need to continue to show up and show out for these games. Flip over to the Argos, and you get the feeling that it's a little more competitive. So they have to go to BC. They play BC.
They go. I got it right here. They go to BC. They're at home to Hamilton, at home to Montreal, bye week, at Winnipeg, home to Ottawa, at Edmonton.
So those are teams on all those given weeks that are either going to be fighting for their playoff lives or fighting for playoff positioning.
Yeah, and every game means something for their opponents.
And the biggest reason why I'm going to say there's potential for it has absolutely zero to do with any kind of element of their team or what they can exploit on other teams. It's just how wacky this CFL season has been. This would be the perfect chaotic thing to happen in the CFL for a year where it's been turnaround city, whether it's been Winnipeg, whether it's been the BC Lions are turning things around, whether it's been
Ottawa,
Edmonton,
overall.
whether it's been Ottawa, it's Hamilton's turn to take the league by storm for 6 weeks. And of course you can look at what they've done and completely shred that argument, but I am going to say it here and now that it's not just not impossible, but it's far from impossible. It's not plausible, but it's far from impossible that if for some reason this Hamilton team can get things going, there's potential. And I'm sorry to listeners, to watchers, to viewers I've wasted their time trying to put a case here for the Hamilton Tiger Cats to make the playoffs, but there it is.
Hey, well, listen, I appreciate the effort, and the fact of the matter is the key thing that you mentioned is that Hamilton already has the season series against Toronto. They're 3-9. Toronto is 6-6. Can they make up 3 games and be tied with the Argos and win the tiebreaker? Is it likely? No. Maybe that's another thing I've got to ask the Cool Bet guys for, a nice little prop on the Ticats to pull out a miracle. But Argos have really tough games. They haven't looked very good lately. And listen, we'll be watching the Ticats to see if they can pull off the upset at home against Ottawa, because if they do, Toronto's got a very tough game in BC. If all of a sudden it goes that way and it's 2 games, Hamilton beats the Argos the next week, And we're talking about going into week 17 with a 1-game difference between those clubs. So certainly not impossible. Hey, before we go, we have talked about the MOP this season. We're now past game 12 or 13 for most teams. And I still have a hard time even putting together a legitimate group of candidates that separate themselves from others. I will say this. I still think it's Cody Fajardo and a bit of a gap and then a bunch of other contenders. But, I mean, it's not like the case for Fajardo is so strong. Like, has he played well? Absolutely. Is their team the best in the league? Yes. He did miss 3 games when Davis Alexander came in and looked pretty damn good himself. What's different about this year is that with injuries and playing time, there doesn't seem to be a lot of other legitimate contenders. And it's opening up conversations to go where we rarely do to the defensive side of the football. Who knows? I've heard some people in special teams being so important thinking about kickers. But I will still put my vote on September 11th for Cody Fajardo. I think he's been the leader of the best team in the league. But after that, I mean, just putting together the finalists, I think, is difficult. If you're not, let's just talk about the West. Who's the nominee in the West for the award? We could probably talk about this for an hour, but Jeff, right now, where we're at, who are the candidates right now? Who's in the mix for the MOP of the CFL for 2024?
It's hard, man. Like, it's hard. It is hard, and I find it to be so hilarious / fitting that a year where things are up in the air and you're not wondering who it is, it's Cody Fajardo rising to the top as the potential, MOP as he was in 2019, when you had all those rash of injuries to all the top end quarterbacks, and of course, Banks ended up walking away with it in the East. That being said, this season, I'm with you, man. I mean, there's some, you mentioned some defensive players. I mean, if Tyrell Ford continues to, I mean, I know we're not talking MOP for DB. It's, I know it's something, but if he continues to play the way he's playing, why can't he be in the conversation? Roland Milligan, this guy in Saskatchewan, I know they're winless in 7 games, but that guy shows up week to week. He's knocking it out of the park on special teams and defense. You look at guys like Janarian Grant, who had such a hot start. Like, these are the names, like before, you mentioned the West, before the BC Lions picked up Nathan Rourke, it seemed like Vernon Adams was the runaway MOP. He might not start another game for the rest of the season healthy. So, it's, Justin McInnes was leading the league in receiving. He was an early standout. He's kind of fallen off a cliff over the last little while. Alexander
he still
Hall
does have a
BC.
big lead. I'm just pulling up the receiving yards right now. McInnes, and I mean, we think about this because he was absolutely invisible against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in those 2 games, which were so important, especially the shutout here in Winnipeg. He does, though. He's the only 1,000-yard receiver right now in the league at 1,074, ahead of Justin Hardy at 910 with Ottawa. And I will say this, McInnes is interesting because if he were to win, it's almost like a combo win sharing the award between VA and Nathan Rourke.
Totally. I mean, and the other, like someone we're missing, Huss, forgetting right in our backyard, Brady Oliveira is not leading the league in rushing, but he's right behind. He's in second, and you have a guy, he set a new personal high for catches in a season already with plenty of runway to add on to that number. But he doesn't have a touchdown all season. So how do you give the most outstanding player in the league award to a guy on offense with no touchdowns? But we brought this MOP idea up, not to, find out different people from the West who could maybe supplant, Cody Fajardo in the East seems to be your runaway pick. It's to acknowledge the absolute disrespect that we've been putting on the name of Drew Brown and what he's done in Ottawa. I think he is a guy that needs to be considered in the conversation as most outstanding player. Maybe it feels more like a Hart Trophy candidate award for him, where he's the most important player on the Red Blacks. But what he's been able to do in Ottawa will remind everybody the Red Blacks were dead last in the East the last 2 seasons with identical 4-14 records. I know he's had a bit of injury issues and has missed a game here this season, but he's been the guy who has led that team to victories, finding ways to win. And he's had some impressive performances. You look at stats out there and, in the game, and he's had a handful of 349 passing yards last game against Toronto. 2 games before that, 390 against the BC Lions. He had 325 against Calgary, 480 against Edmonton. He's had these big standout games, and he's taken a team who has been in the dumpsters of the standings and helped them rise to close to being at the top of the East. And that to me matters. And the one more argument, the point is there's still plenty of football left to be played, and there hopefully becomes a clear-cut winner here by the end of the season. But another reason for Drew Brown is that Chad Kelly won last year, and he was 4th in the league in passing yards. So I don't think you need to lead the league in touchdowns or in passing yards to be viewed as the most outstanding player in the league. You need to play smart football and effective football, and we're seeing a lot of that, and dynamic football, and we're seeing a lot of that from Drew Brown this year.
Well, it's so funny. I'm looking at these quarterback stats, and Bo Levi's staring me in the face, leading the league in both passing yards and passing touchdowns.
Right.
On the team that we just were trying to come up with the possibility of a way they could get back into it and be a playoff team. But Drew Brown, to your point, is 5th in passing yards and 7th in passing touchdowns. And Cody Fajardo, with the time that he's missed, is 7th in passing yards, albeit 6th in passing touchdowns. The guys that have been throwing for the most yards, it's Bo, it's MBT.
He's on the bench.
He's on the bench again, and Troy Ford's coming back. Zach Caleros, who has, missed a little bit of time and, has had far more picks, less touchdowns than he normally has.
The whole talk around Zach has been how he's not been the same Zach Caleros, so he's not winning the MOP this year.
Jake Mayer, we can definitely cross him off the list.
Lucky to be in the league next season.
And then we're talking about Vernon Adams, and Trevor Harris. This is normally a quarterback award. There is no shoe-in for the quarterback. And listen, Chad Kelly did win it on the back of a 16-2 record last year. Many people disagreed with the choice, but whatever. He won it. To me, it's that record of the Montreal Alouettes that gives Fajardo the nod right now, but it's very hard to make a passionate pound your fist on the table argument for any of these guys right now. And you know what's great? The final 5 games of this season, or 6, depending on what teams have left on their schedule, will determine everything in the league. And it's unlike any season we've seen in a long time. But there are players that could carry their teams for the next 5 weeks and come from obscurity when it comes to this conversation to maybe being up on the stage.
On that note,
BC.
Huss, if Nathan Rourke, comes from the NFL and lights up the next 5 games for the BC Lions take first place in the West. Is he your guy?
Not for sure, but he would be considered.
Is he your guy out of the West?
As I said, if
I guess the point is,
if they win their next 5 games and it's Rourke that has been, very clearly the catalyst for all of it, someone's winning this award that's missed a significant period of time, whether it's because they've been on the bench or whether they're
injured, in the East or the West,
or whether they've been in the NFL.
Totally.
So I guarantee this one. We may have to have a weekly MOP conversation from here on out as to it'll be the CFL 110 MOP Stock Watch, and tune in next week to see where things stand after these games this week. Speaking of this week, only 3 games. Bombers on the bye, the Riders on the bye, coming out of the heated Labor Day Classic Banjo Bowl series. All the teams in the East are playing, and the Edmonton Elks are also on the bye. Bombers and Elks play at it next week. Heading over to our friends at Coolbet, BC is a -4.5 point favorite against Toronto. The Ottawa Redblacks are 4-point favorites in Hamilton. You've got me thinking about Hamilton and taking the points and maybe a little, although again, disrespect for Ottawa. All they do is win. Yeah. But anyways, Ottawa's 4-point favorites in Hamilton. And the Montreal Alouettes are 5.5-point favorites in Calgary. And if you are wondering about the Grey Cup winner futures right now, BC, with their win against Montreal, has moved into the favorite position. BC's plus 230, Montreal's plus 250. The Bombers are 4-1. The Red Blacks are plus 525. Argos at 8-1. Riders at 11-1. This is what makes no sense to me. The Riders are 11-1. The Elks are 25-1. I think those numbers should almost be reversed, to be honest. And the Elks last week were 36-1. A couple weeks ago, they were 100-1. This team is rolling right now. We'll see what happens when the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and the Elks get together for these back-to-back games. But don't rule that out. And if you want a value play on the board, I would look at Edmonton, Calgary 80-1, and the Ticats plus 250. Never before can I remember it really being as wide open as it is right now, whether we're talking about the Grey Cup, whether we're talking about the West Division, or we're talking about the MOP conversation.
Beauty of the CFL, man. The beauty of this season. It's what felt so predictable at the start of the season has turned anything but, and that's the beauty of this league. I mean, for years they were talking about how boring it was, that the Bombers were, rising, were dominating the league or dominating the West Division, and Toronto was dominating the West or the East Division, and now it's changed. And now it feels like some
did a
teams
180 is what it did. 180
taking some over, and this is what you want, because the last thing you want in a 9-team league is to have half your the teams in your league bottoming out while the other are cemented in those playoff spots. To have meaningful football being played down the stretch is what every market hopes for, and what every league hopes for, and that's certainly the way we're trending. And I don't see it stopping anytime soon, Huss. Well, expect the unexpected. That's the 2024 campaign in the CFL.
I mean, think about last year. I mean, the Argos had already wrapped up the entire East and rested Chad Kelly for what was supposed to be the marquee game of the season, still in September here in Winnipeg. We won't have that issue this year. That is for sure. Great stuff, Hammer, as always. Thanks to everyone that joined us. Great crew in live on YouTube today. Appreciate it. CFL fan, tell a friend about CFL 110. Live every Wednesday here on the Winnipeg Sports Talk channel, following the Winnipeg Sports Talk Daily. Give us a subscription. Just hit the sub button on the YouTube channel. And, of course, wherever you get your favorite podcasts, search CFL 110 and give a sub as well. Big thanks to our presenting sponsor of CFL 110, Garage Living Winnipeg. Don't forget, folks, there's still time to completely renovate and remake your garage heading into the winter. But get on it. Give our friend Pat Kanuga a call, 204-999-1234 for a free in-garage consultation, and check out garageliving.com for amazing examples of the work that will completely change your garage in a good way and add value to your home. That's going to do it for another edition of CFL 110. For Jeff Hamilton, I'm Andrew Paterson. Thanks for hanging with us. Enjoy the games this weekend, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.